At the height of his power, John Gotti rode through Manhattan in a motorcade, ate at the finest restaurants in New York City, and walked into federal courtrooms 3 times, and walked back out a free man while the FBI watched in fury. He died in a prison hospital bed in Springfield, Missouri, in a facility most Americans have never heard of, with throat cancer eating through his neck, unable to speak, unable to swallow, and completely alone. This is not a story about how powerful John Gotti was. Enough people have told that story. This is the story nobody tells. What happened to the most famous mob boss in American history after the cameras turned off, after the Armani suits were replaced with a prison uniform, and after every person who had ever called him boss decided they had somewhere else to be. Because here's what the Gotti legend leaves out: the part that comes after the legend. The part where the system that could not beat him in a courtroom finally found a way to destroy him that no lawyer, no jury, and no amount of money could stop. It did not need a conviction to break John Gotti. It just needed time, and a cell, and a disease that does not care who you used to be. Stop scrolling. If you have ever wondered what actually happens to men like this when the power runs out, you're in the right place. Subscribe right now, because this channel covers the stories that end after the headlines stop, and this one is the most devastating we have told yet. To understand what the prison years took from John Gotti, you first have to understand what John Gotti had built, because the fall only means something if you understand the height. James Joseph Gotti, known to all of New York as John, was born on October 27, 1940, in the South Bronx, the fifth of 13 children in a desperately poor Italian-American family that moved constantly to escape poverty and never fully escaped it. By the time he was 12 years old, Gotti was running errands for the Fulton Rockaway Boys, a street gang operating under the influence of the Gambino crime family in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn. By 16, he had already been arrested multiple times. By his early 20s, he had graduated from street crime into the formal structure of organized crime, disciplined, hierarchical, and brutally effective. He had found the only world that made complete sense to him, and he intended to rise to the top of it. He did exactly that. By December 1985, Gotti orchestrated the assassination of Gambino family boss Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. A public execution so bold, it shocked even the people who had spent their careers studying organized crime. Within weeks, Gotti was the boss of the most powerful crime family in America. He was 45 years old. He wore $1,000 suits. He held court openly in Little Italy. He became the most famous organized crime figure in the United States since Al Capone. And he did it all while the FBI filmed him constantly and could not make anything stick. 3 federal trials, 3 acquittals. The FBI called him the Teflon Don. Nothing attached. But what the FBI had, and what Gotti did not fully understand until it was too late, was patience. And a man inside his own organization who was about to give them everything they needed. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano was Gotti's underboss, the second most powerful man in the Gambino family, a man who had committed 19 murders, and who John Gotti trusted more than almost anyone alive. When federal agents arrested both men in December 1990 and played Gotti's surveillance recordings that included him discussing crimes on tape, Gravano made a calculation. He flipped. He became a government witness, and he handed the FBI John Gotti on a plate so complete there was nothing left to defend. At trial in 1992, Gravano's testimony was devastating. He described murders, extortion schemes, and the inner mechanics of Gambino family operations in detail that no amount of courtroom skill could overcome. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all 13 counts, including murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. He showed no emotion at the verdict. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, at that time one of the most restrictive federal prisons in the country. Marion operated under a permanent lockdown status following the murders of two correctional officers in 1983. Inmates spent over 20 hours a day in their cells. Movement was severely restricted. Programming was minimal. It was, by design, a place that removed every element of status, autonomy, and social interaction from the men inside it. A direct philosophical attack on everything John Gotti had spent his life building. Inside Marion, Gotti was placed in the most restrictive housing unit available. He was separated from general population. His communications were monitored. Visits were controlled. The FBI, convinced that even from inside a federal prison, Gotti could attempt to run Gambino family operations, maintained surveillance on his correspondence and visitor logs. The system was not finished with him simply because it had him. It intended to make sure that what he had built on the outside could not reach him on the inside. But here's what the surveillance logs and the restriction protocols could not capture. What was happening to John Gotti internally? No, because the man who had built his entire identity on visibility, on being seen, on commanding rooms and commanding loyalty, was now spending 23 hours a day in a cell where nobody was watching him for any reason that made him powerful. The audience was gone. The suits were gone. The restaurants were gone. The only thing that remained was the man. And for a man like Gotti, that was the most devastating removal of all. Gotti's family visited. His son, John Gotti Jr., made the trip. His wife Victoria came. His daughter Victoria came. But federal restrictions on contact visits, monitored conversations, and the sheer logistics of visiting a maximum security federal prison in rural Illinois meant that the visits were infrequent, controlled, and nothing like the access his family had always had to him. So he was physically present in their lives, but functionally absent from them in every way that had previously defined his role. The provider, the protector, the man at the center of everything. In 1996, 4 years into his sentence, John Gotti was diagnosed with throat and neck cancer. He'd been a heavy smoker for most of his adult life. The cancer was advanced. It required surgery and radiation treatment. And it began, slowly, methodically, and without mercy, to take from him the one thing that had always been his most powerful instrument, his voice. Here's what I want you to do right now. Pause and think about this. A man whose entire power came from being heard, from speaking and having rooms go silent, from giving orders that people followed on pain of death, losing his ability to speak inside a federal prison. Comment below what you think that felt like. I want to read every response. The cancer treatment required specialized medical care that USP Marion could not provide. In 1999, Gotti was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, the federal prison system's primary facility for inmates with serious medical conditions. It was not a transfer to a better situation. It was a transfer to the place where federal inmates go to die. Everyone in the system understood what an FMC Springfield transfer meant. So did John Gotti. FMC Springfield is a federal medical prison that operates simultaneously as a correctional facility and a long-term medical care unit. Its population consists largely of inmates with terminal illnesses, severe chronic conditions, and catastrophic injuries. For a man who had spent his entire life in rooms full of powerful people, the population of FMC Springfield represented a more complete form of isolation than any solitary confinement unit could have manufactured. Because here, every person around him was also broken, also diminished, and also waiting. Inside FMC Springfield, Gotti continued to receive visitors, but the visits became progressively more difficult to watch for the people who came. His son, John Jr., described his father's physical deterioration in terms that made clear that the cancer was advancing faster than the treatment could manage. The man who had walked into 3 federal courtrooms, exuding controlled dominance, was losing weight rapidly, struggling to speak clearly, and experiencing the kind of pain that the federal medical system managed with medication but could not eliminate. What made Gotti's final years at FMC Springfield particularly devastating, according to people who had access to accounts from inside the facility, was not the physical suffering. It was the silence around it. Because the men who had called him boss, who had attended his 4th of July parties in Howard Beach, who had stood beside him in Little Italy while the neighborhood treated him like a mayor, Those men were either dead, imprisoned themselves in witness protection having testified against him, or living quiet civilian lives they had carefully constructed at a safe distance from his name. Sammy Gravano, the man whose testimony had put Gotti in that cell, had been relocated under witness protection, and given a new identity and was living in Arizona. He was later arrested on drug charges in 2000 and sentenced to 19 years, a fact that provided Gotti with the only satisfaction available to him in those years. But satisfaction does not treat cancer, and Gravano's fall did not open the cell door. It just gave Gotti something to feel about, while the disease continued its work. Inside FMC Springfield, Gotti's day operated on the rhythms of the medical facility rather than the rhythms of the street. Medication schedules, treatment appointments, medical checks. The institutional calendar of a man whose body had become the primary subject of institutional attention, not because he was powerful, but because he was sick. For a man who had spent decades being the subject of attention for entirely different reasons, the nature of the attention he now received was its own form of punishment. His speech deteriorated significantly in his final years. The throat cancer and the treatment had damaged his vocal cords to the point where speaking at volume or at length became difficult and then painful. In a man whose voice had been his primary instrument of authority, the voice that gave orders, the voice that silenced rooms, the voice that had held court in the Ravenite Social Club, while FBI surveillance equipment recorded every word. The erosion of that voice was not simply a medical symptom. It was the erasure of the last remaining element of what had made him John Gotti. Now, former inmates and correctional staff who were at FMC Springfield during Gotti's final years described a man who had become physically unrecognizable from the figure who had dominated newspaper front pages through the 1980s. The weight loss was severe. The physical presence that had always amplified the legend was gone. What remained was an old man in a federal medical prison uniform, in significant pain, receiving treatment that was extending his life without improving it, in a facility in Missouri that most of America did not know existed. This is the part of the story that nobody who builds the Gotti legend wants to tell, because it dismantles the legend completely. The myth of John Gotti is built on invincibility. 3 trials, 3 acquittals. The Teflon Don, the man the government could not beat. But the government was never trying to beat John Gotti in a courtroom. The courtroom was just the door. What was waiting on the other side of that door, the cell, the years, the disease, the silence, the invisibility, that was the actual sentence. And that sentence, unlike the legal one, had no appeal process. In early 2002, Gotti's condition became critical. The cancer had progressed to a stage where treatment was no longer producing meaningful results. His medical team at FMC Springfield shifted the focus of his care from treatment to management. The medical system's language for acknowledging that the fight has been lost, and the remaining work is about reducing suffering rather than reversing the outcome. He was 61 years old. His family was notified that the end was approaching. His son John Jr., his wife Victoria, and other family members made arrangements to be present. The federal system, which had monitored and restricted his family contact for a decade, allowed increased family access in his final weeks. This is standard federal protocol for terminal inmates. It is also in the context of a man who had spent a decade in restricted contact with the people he loved, one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire story. On June 10, 2002, John Joseph Gotti died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. The cause of death was head and neck cancer. He had served 10 years of a life sentence. He died in a federal medical prison in a city he had no connection to, surrounded by institutional equipment and medical staff, in far from Howard Beach and far from Little Italy, and far from every room he had ever commanded. The most famous mob boss in American history died the way the system always intended powerful men to die, quietly, far away, and without an audience. Here's what John Gotti's death inside FMC Springfield actually means. Not as a mob story, but as a human one. He spent the last decade of his life paying for 30 years of choices that had made him feel invincible. The disease did not care about the acquittals. The cell did not care about the suits. The silence of FMC Springfield did not care about the myth. Every single thing he had built his identity around, the power, the visibility, the loyalty, the voice, was taken from him systematically and completely before the cancer finished the job. And the government did not beat John Gotti in a courtroom. It outlasted him in a hospital bed. His body was returned to New York and he was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the same cemetery where other Gambino family figures had been buried before him. Thousands attended the funeral. The neighborhood came out the way it always had for him. The flowers were excessive. The line of mourners was long. It was the last public moment that resembled anything from the life he had built. And every person standing at that cemetery knew, whether they said it or not, that the man in the casket had not died the way the myth deserved. He had died the way the system designed it. Alone, sick, silenced, and completely forgotten by the men who had called him boss. If this story hit you differently than you expected, that is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe right now. The next story is already written, and it is even darker than this one. You do not want to miss it, and the algorithm will not show it to you unless you are subscribed. Somewhere in a federal archive in Missouri, there is a medical file with the name James Joseph Gotti on the cover. It documents every treatment, every decline, every medication adjustment, and every day of the last years of the most famous mob boss in American history. Nobody has made a movie about those years. Nobody has made a television series about those years. The myth ends at the conviction because what comes after the conviction is not a myth. It is just a man in a room, getting smaller until he is gone.